What is the role of the novelist beyond fiction? Debating this question, we have our next set of speakers, authors Amitava Kumar, Prayag Akbar, and Robert Desai, in conversation with the Hindu's Ideas editor, Minnie Kapoor. Unfortunately, one of our scheduled speakers, Heidi Julowitz, is unable to join us today because of a medical emergency, but please do welcome the other speakers onto the stage.
It's a pleasure to have with me three of the most powerful writers I know, and three writers who are uniquely placed to address the subject we have before us today, whether the role of the novelist beyond fiction. I thought a good way to start is to just ask all three of them to open the discussion with their thoughts on the subject, because I think all three will probably have slightly different takes. Prayag, would you like to go?
I think, this topic is slightly confusing to me because we're talking about the role of the role of the novel. Fiction is a very high goal in itself. The act of representation, the act of putting something that you see out in the world, being able to represent it accurately, being able to portray it in an artistic way is certainly a very, very difficult thing for any writer to achieve. And I'm not sure that the novelist really has a role beyond just that one very important purpose, which is the act of representation. If you talk about the public sphere, like making interventions in the public sphere, I'm not entirely convinced that the novelist has, that there should be this kind of imperative that the novelist should step out of just the act of representation. For me, the act of representation is a tremendously difficult thing to do in any case. And the more, and sometimes I think that the more a writer steps out of that solitary purpose of writing, the more it affects the other things that the writing itself, because there's a lot you can achieve there's a lot you can achieve in terms of explaining the world or in terms of representing the world just through the act of fiction.
Robert, you've actually stopped writing fiction for a long while, so I think...
but I have not stopped telling lies, you see. I think that the role of the writer is to tell lies, and the role of the fiction writer is to tell beautiful lies. And that's what I try to do. I think that my role, if I have a role, I'm not sure that I accept the word role. I once lived in the Soviet Union. I'm tired of the word role, is to give pleasure. That's what I'm here for. And if someone is instructed and improved through reading my beautiful lies, then I am very happy. But I feel free to write whatever I want, and the reader should feel free to take whatever it's usually a she or he wishes to take.
Actually, that's something we'll come back to when we talk about the role of the writer beyond fiction, because it's women who sustain, women readers who sustain fiction these days.
They go to the bookshops, they buy the books, they read the books. Without women, we are nothing.
Amita?
Robert, can you say that again?
Moving between fiction and non-fiction, so...
Sure. Robert, can you say that again? My task is to give pleasure. I want to hear that again.
My task is to give pleasure.
All right, a clap. Come, wake up, audience. All right. Beautiful. Now you have made me forget what I was going to say. What was I going to say? I don't know. Arundhati Roy has that great phrase when she started writing non-fiction that was political manifestos, basically. They started calling her writer-activist. And she said, it's like saying sofa bed, there should, it's either a bed or a sofa, and she wanted to be, a writer has, the role of the writer encompasses all those things, and we shouldn't think, politics somewhere and literature is somewhere else. The thing, let me start with what Prayag said. The task of the writer is to represent something, he said. It's not to necessarily march on the street, if that's a poor paraphrase. Okay. Well, one of the best things that I learned from someone like Edward Said was that when Jane Austen writes about let's say, a romance, a domestic romance in a small town in England, when they sit down, a man and a woman, a young man and a young woman, sit down to have tea, that tea, the sugar at the bottom of the cup is colonialism. Because nowhere in England do you grow sugarcane or can you grow tea. Cool? In other words, politics doesn't have to be an overt task of you don't have to portray it in some wildly explicit way. It is present in your observations. So the task of the writer is to observe. And through that observation, you portray differences in class, in caste. In caste, by the way, unless you're a Dalit, you don't have much of caste in Indian fiction, by the way, in English. But so that sort of thing. That's my...
Can I attack you?
Only if you give me pleasure.
What you say is true about the sugar, naturally. But does anyone actually read Pride and Prejudice in order to learn about colonialism? No, they don't. They read because it's a romance. And if you go back to the beginning of the novel, and I can only go back, let's say, to Daphnis and Chloe of Longus, the Greek writer, which is 1900 years or so. I don't know enough about what came before that. You have exactly what you have today. A man falls in love with a woman, everything goes wrong, and then eventually they come together again. I have in Australia a friend who writes exactly the same thing. Only the names are changed. Nearly 2,000 years later. Well, the only thing that can change now is it doesn't have to be a man and a woman. It can be two men or two women or two people who don't know who they are or are in a terrible muddle. But basically, the situation, the geometry, is precisely the same. And I have never read Jane Austen to find out about colonialism or anything else. I read Jane Austen to have my heart go boom, boom, boom and expand.
If I can just pick up from that, I mean, the thing that drives fiction is a romance. And I think the subject before us today is, are novelists perhaps better placed in whatever terms they address the story before them to represent the world around us. So Prayag, your book is at the heart of it a romance. And I think when you set out to write it, you were driven, I mean, at least on reading it, I don't know if you were driven by character. But through that romance, Prayag has produced a book which helps us make sense of the world around us.
I think yes, my book is a love story in some ways. It's also a story of the love between a mother and her daughter. I'm a little,
it's about the freedom to love.
Romance. Yeah, it is about love in many ways, but I was actually, the idea of a romance reminded me of of a story from last year, actually one of my favorite stories from last year. I'm going away from my book now, but, and I was thinking about this role of the novelist in terms of being able to, make a difference in the political theater, political sphere. And one of my favorite stories from last year out of America was about this comedian, like I think he was a young comedian who one night got really, really drunk, and he tweeted that I'm going to write this novel about Trump and about Donald Trump and a bellboy in a hotel. And he actually wrote this novel, and he wrote a novel overnight, I think, while he was totally smashed, wrote a novel overnight, and it became a bestseller. And it was like one of the bestsellers on Amazon. And, he was actually able to provide this very, it was a very amusing novel. I mean, I read a part of it, and it was like, his hair was glistening like a rat's nest, and it was like, so he was able to provide this very like sharp satire about Trump and who he was and what kind of like, what role he occupied in the American imagination. But, and it was a novel. It just shows you the possibilities of fiction, even non-serious fiction, even something that is done like in a very slapdash manner can have this really big impact and make people look at, make a figure of authority lampoon a figure of authority so effectively.
Robert, you would probably not agree with that,
I don't agree, no, with anything very much, I suppose. I suppose what I think is that if you set out to change the world, you probably won't. So I look at the career of Tolstoy. For example, my background, the audience won't know this, is in Russian literature, teaching Russian literature, 19th century, basically. As soon as Tolstoy decided to change the world, everything went awry. He wrote Anna Karenina, he wrote War and Peace, and then he decided that he would improve humanity and address the ills of society, and basically people stopped reading him. What do we read now in Hobart, in Tasmania? What do we go to our bookstores and buy in huge numbers? Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, War and Peace. That's what stays. Why does it stay? It stays because he wrote about the human heart. That's why it stays. I recently read one of your most famous writers' very famous books. I won't say who. That's right, yes, you got it in one. And I realized when I read the book that I didn't care about what she had to say. Not that it wasn't important, not that it's not important to Indians or even to me, not that her English is not 10 times more elegant than my English, but I simply didn't care. Why not? Because she didn't do anything for me in here. And that's what the great novelists do. They don't set out to do it, they just do it. And so this man who wrote about Donald Trump, he will disappear and no one will remember he even existed. But everyone will remember that Leo Tolstoy existed, and that Turgenev existed, and Pushkin existed, and Gogol existed, and probably even Amitav Ghosh existed. Whether they will remember that Vikram Seth existed, I don't know. I would have thought they would, but I'm beginning to doubt.
Actually, Prayag, if I can come back to you, because I think to your book, which Prayag doesn't, as he's very clear, he doesn't use the word love jihad in his book, but his book is about, you know, walls, literally walls coming up between identities, between communities, and just the impossibility of loving beyond the walls. You started with a story, but it has a current resonance. So one does address the reality around oneself, but what would the starting point, we've read about love jihad in reportage, but your story is driven by a character, this mother searching for her daughter. So if you start with a good character, you do capture the world around you.
Well, I think so. I think, as you said, again, good, or if you're trying to write good fiction, you have to have this very human story, this very human element to it. And that has to be really the force that runs through the novel. You know, that's what keeps the reader interested, no matter how important the world is that you're creating to the story. If you're not constantly sort of dwelling on the person's reaction to that world, you know, what that world is doing to her inner self, you're really going away from what a novel can do and what fiction can do. And when I started writing it, of course, it was very influenced. I think a lot of what was happening in India at that time, in the last couple of years, the last 2-3 years, it really sharpened my ideas of, you know, it sharpened my ideas of what I wanted to write about, and it started to bother me more and more, and I think the book became, the narrative became sharper because of it, you know, it became more potent perhaps because of it. But it was always about this mother and her daughter, you know, it was about her being separated from her husband and about her mother and her daughter, and I really wanted to try and explore how this, you know, this kind of overarching political state can have this kind of really devastating effect on someone's life. And, you know, it's able to separate a mother and a daughter, which to me is like, you know, it's one of the relationships that really holds our societies together. And it can, you know, if you have this kind of very devastating effect on one family, it really shows how you can sort of, you know, like, it kind of echoes the devastation that it can create on a much larger scale.
Amitav, you keep traveling between fiction and non-fiction, using the techniques of fiction in your non-fiction and using reportage, etc., in your fiction. Why do I do that? Well, yeah, sure. And I'll ask my question.
You know, when I was writing my first novel, I was interested in this Bollywood actor Manoj Bajpayee, because he's from a village close to mine in Bihar. And when I saw him in Satya, this was in the States, I saw him on my television screen and he seemed to just explode out. You know, his energy was so dynamic as a gangster. And the question that struck me at that moment was, what did he have to learn in order to get to that stage? And what did he need to unlearn to get to that stage? Cool? All right. So I called Shyam Benegal and asked him, put me in touch. We got together. I did many hours of interviews. And he had an immense candor, which many other Bollywood actors don't have, of saying things like, yeah, I did not have any English, I did not know how to, they would make me, in Ramjas, they made me read English newspapers because they just wanted to laugh. And he said, मुझे याद है, एक title था, University Close Sine Die. तो मैंने उसको पढ़ा साइन डाई तो उसको सब लोग बहुत हंस रहे थे मुझ पे एंड देन आई यूज्ड टू मैं बेड वेटिंग करता था बहुत तो आई यूज्ड टू वेट माय बेड सो देयर वाज दिस थिंग बट आई डिड नॉट गेट एनीथिंग मोर फ्रॉम हिम एंड दैट इज द गिफ्ट ऑफ फिक्शन दैट यू इन ऑर्डर टू एक्सप्लोर इंटीरियरिटीज the dream life of an individual, all the unspoken thoughts, conflicts, contradictions, that is what fiction does. Cool? So I had to go there, leaving non-fiction behind in order to do it. But there's something else that can I speak for 37 more seconds? You know, in response to apartheid, there was Nadine Gordimer writing very direct fiction that addressed contemporary realities in a stark way, in a bold way. But I must say, I'm much more drawn to someone Robert doesn't warm up to so much, J.M. Coetzee, another South African writer, who in books like Waiting for the Barbarians didn't seem to be writing about South Africa, but he was writing about South Africa, where precisely it is the distance, the obliqueness, the indirection that produces more political fiction than seemingly political fiction. Disgrace.
Will you permit me to agree with you about something? I would just like to bring in a different term now to say what you have said. I think what fiction does is let people know what it feels like to be someone they are not. The first book that I ever wrote that I called a novel was about being diagnosed with HIV. And my aim was not to tell people anything about HIV. In fact, HIV is never used in the novel. The word is not there. If you want to find something out about HIV, you can look it up on Wikipedia, or you can go and read some medical journal. No one needs to learn anything from me. I wanted people to know, this is many years ago when it was a death sentence, what it felt like to be given a death sentence. Not what a death sentence is, but what it feels like. And so all sorts of people wrote letters saying, well, you know, you've helped me understand my mother, or you've helped me understand my son. Quite often it was my son. And so I felt I'd done something worthwhile. Not that I have something unique to say, but through the poetics of the text, I tried to find a unique way of saying the rather ordinary thing I had to say. And that's what you were talking about.
And I agree with you.
And we agree with each other. We've got a problem here already.
It's love. I love the novels of W.G. Sebald because they never use the word Holocaust, but they are drenched with the sadness and melancholy of what happened in the Holocaust. So let's keep that also in mind, where fiction goes beyond itself, if that's the word we want, by having an indirect object and an indirect style. And that is its strength, because in reportage, I mean, the good editors of The Hindu, if they are here, they will not allow the reporter to file a story on a riot that has taken place without mentioning what, where, when, how, why, right?
Exactly.
But in fiction, you do it otherwise, right?
And fiction also helps you fill in the spaces. I mean, I think, like you said, all good nonfiction lies.
And there are many spaces in real life, of course. And so yes, you can fill them in when you are writing fiction.
So when you write a memoir, and Robert, this is a form that you've been working with now for a while. When you write a memoir, are you in a space between fiction and nonfiction?
Yes, I suppose I am. I choose the word memoir because nobody quite knows what it means, including me. And so it's a very useful word. It used to mean, about 300 years ago, the sort of thing a French prostitute would write, in which she would reveal the fact that she had slept with the Archbishop of Paris. You usually had some sort of deep scandal at the basis of your memoir. I don't really have anything quite as exciting as sex with the Archbishop of Paris to report, but I try to focus on some kind of anxiety when I write a memoir, and to work through it in front of you, because I think that will give you pleasure, and it will give you a sense of being close to the voice that you can hear in my book. But I do not feel obliged to tell the exact truth, because the poetics of the text, the shaping, the patterning of the text takes over. It was interesting in the movie, this is a very short story, it will only take me 20 seconds to say this. In the new movie about A.A. Milne and Christopher Robin, A.A. Milne says, well, Christopher Robin goes down to the palace with Alice. Her name is not Alice, but he had to go down to the palace with a woman whose name rhymed with palace, so I called her Alice. Her actual name was New. Well, I do that sort of thing all the time. If I need alliteration, I will say my mother was born in 1944, even if it was 1943, because alliteration is more important than the exact year.
Amitabh, you've also been working with the form of the memoir in many ways, including in profiling your hometown, Patna, in talking about your own experiences of, growing up in Delhi, moving to the US, and they inform your fiction also. So where is this blurry line? I mean,
the blurry line is that we cannot set up segregated spaces called fiction and non-fiction.
Exactly.
You are agreeing to me. And when I began writing about Patna, I thought, what would it mean to present the biography of the town from the position of the rat? You know, the rats that have been drinking the drinking liquor that the police has confiscated, and the police claims that the liquor is gone because the rats have drunk it. The rats that have made holes under the railway platform and are causing accidents, the rats that have chewed the cables in the hospitals, etc., etc. So why do I make this point? I want to say that just as in fiction you search for point of view and think about characters and etc., etc., in non-fiction it is the same. One of the startling things about Catherine Boo's prize-winning book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, about Mumbai's slum, is in some part how she effaces herself and looks for a form where everything is as if it has been closely observed, but not by her. I mean, so these little devices are actually things that have more common in fiction, but they are very much a part of non-fiction too. And so yeah, the line of control must be abolished.
Can I add a little thing? That's one of my favorite books, by the way. And I've found it very difficult to find books that knock my socks off. And quite a few of the books that have knocked my socks off have been Indian ones. And I do not say that in order to please you. It's the absolute truth. Very few Australian books, but Indian books, and that one in particular, it's wonderful. And to give another example, it's that book about cricket. What's it called?
Selection Day.
Selection Day,
Arvind Adiga.
set in Mumbai. Now, it taught me more about, I hate cricket. I'm terribly sorry, loathe it. Cricket, to watch cricket, from my point of view, is like being dead. And I feel that I will be dead for a long time, so why should I practice now? But I read this wonderful book, which is saturated with cricket, not to learn about cricket. That was the way in. I learned about Mumbai, or what I took to be Mumbai. And I thought it was wonderful.
It's interesting you say that, because I know one of the criticisms that Selection Day got was that it, and I didn't agree with this at all, but it was that it didn't represent Bombay cricket in the way, you know, a lot of like people who'd come up to the state, the game and played the game in Bombay and, you know, worked through the zonal level and all of that. I mean, I think Adiga was not, he was more interested in telling the story of this boy and telling the story of the family and how they created that environment where he could play, and less interested in how actually, you know, the mechanics of Bombay cricket actually work.
Good.
But yeah, so no, that's what it is. I think what sort of he was, that's exactly what you want,
exactly
right?
What I want.
In a novel. It's not like, it's not about trying to show, okay, now you do this and this is the selector you must talk to and all of that, but instead trying to create a really human story and something that really resonates with the reader.
That's right.
I'm actually very conflicted about that. Because on one hand, I like the idea that you're not performing anthropology. Cool? But on the other hand, I must say, a part of me craves for authenticity. And if the detail is wrong, I'm like, nah. So, for example, Adiga's first book seemed to me a travesty, because his representation of Bihari migrant laborers and their return home was shockingly unreal. About women coming and grabbing the money off their husbands and disrobing them and leaving them. And I didn't ever see that happen, and I've traveled with them all the time. So, and I feel bad, because then you want, oh, a reportorial authority. And I feel, well, stories have to be about something else, and I respect that demand too. But I'm just saying that I'm conflicted. At some level, I want that other thing, but at the other level, I want the gritty detail that's like dirt under the fingernails, you know?
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I do think that's fair enough. It's a fair enough comment. You don't want something that is totally implausible. Lies should always be plausible.
But Prayag, just you set he sets his book in the near future, but it's in the future. Was that a way for you to get away from this burden of authenticity?
It's not actually set in the future. I didn't specify a time. I didn't specify a time, and I didn't specify a city. And that was a conscious decision. I don't think it was a way for me to get away from what's actually happening, because the book is very much about what's been happening. And I feel like I was trying to write about trajectories that predate even this government. You know, it's something that the kind of segregation we have in our cities and all that, these are long-standing problems, you know, that date back, I mean, basically to the history of urbanization in India, you know. And so I wasn't trying to get away from anything by setting it in the future, but I think it gives you, by not naming the city...
Did it liberate you?
Yeah, it gives you certain freedoms. You know, I could bring in elements of Bombay, where I've lived and spent time. I could bring in elements of Delhi. And in both those cities, people have come to me and said, oh, you know, this is, you've written about Delhi. And someone else is like, you've written about Bombay. But it was actually something, I mean, it wasn't so important for me to locate my story in a specific, you know, in Delhi, in this part of Delhi, but actually to create elements that are recognizable to the reader, to create elements that someone, you know, to create things that that the reader can take home and be like, this is mine, you know, that this is something that I've experienced, this is something that I have felt, or, you know, seen about my city.
Sorry, Robert, you were saying something? Did I cut you? Oh, yes.
No, I was just going to say, ex-wives are the worst. They always claim that what you've written is about them. I mean, I've only got one, but yes, that has always been a problem. People see what they want to see, and they take what they want to take. The other little point I wanted to make, apropos of absolutely nothing at all, is that I think it helps if a writer understands, in writing fiction or non-fiction or something in between, literature, that no one cares about you. I keep that in the forefront of my mind the whole time. And I'm not being, what is the right word, modest? It's not my leading, yes, quality.
It's not your weakness.
Not my weakness or virtue, really. I know that no one could care less. Possibly my partner, the dog, occasionally, but really no one cares. People care about themselves, their own families, and so you have to write in such a way that you feel, that your readers feel you're opening up the world for them.
This is a great point. But let's bring it down to what has been happening at this festival. 2 evenings ago, I was at a session on the crisis of the literary novel. There were maybe 20 people there, right? And then we had yesterday Jignesh speaking. There wasn't space to breathe. There were so many people packed in. Now, what is that a statement about? It's not really that people don't care about you. People don't care about the literary novel or something. You know what I'm saying? And should the writer respond to that? Should we always be producing writing that is like blood on the bandage, you know? Actually, I want to edit an anthology called Blood on the Bandage. Jeet, please contribute to that. An event happens and someone writes, you know, how do writers bring a different thing than only those who do reporting? What I want to say is that the fact that there was so much of interest, there are some things that are just, they are live, they put people on fire. And writers have the privilege, fiction writers mostly, or even non-fiction writers, they have the privilege of retreating from that, and they should exercise it. But they also have a unique way to address it and leap into the fire and produce something extraordinary.
Respond
and that
to
should
the
also
character.
Say. So I want to say that, you know, make a case for that also.
But I don't think we should fetishize suffering all the same. And I think, at least in Australia, I don't know what the situation is in India, we do fetishize suffering. Suffering because of race, or because of your sex, or because of your economic situation. And of course these things need to be talked about on television, on the screen, in books, in the classroom. But we should not fetishize. Pleasure is what humans...
Fetishize pleasure.
Robert's latest book is The Pleasures of Leisure.
Well, I was talking to some young people in Calcutta the other day from the Telegraph newspaper, I'm sorry, not part of the Hindu, and they were about 16 years old, and they asked me very intelligent, searching questions and looked faintly bored. And then one of them said, "And what books did you read as a child?" And I said, "Enid Blyton." Then they were on side with me. No suffering in Enid Blyton, or very little suffering. But they felt immediately a connection with me, a connection with joy, a connection with adventure, a connection with friendship, a connection with a dog, of course, because in Enid Blyton you have to have a dog, you can't do anything without a dog. And it was a wonderful lesson to me. Biggles I also mentioned, and the boys looked interested in Biggles, the girl less so, I suppose, really. It was a lesson that, despite all the frightful things going on in the world, on the front page of the Hindu this morning, frightful suffering, aching, pain, problems that can't be solved, people have a right to some pleasure and to some joy. And I think that we can do that as well as giving them ways through the morass.
Yes. But again, I don't think those two things can be necessarily so distinct from one another. No. You know, to be able to write, I mean, it's not that you set out to, you know, capture suffering. You know that you
some do.
Well, I guess so.
They do.
You know, you want to be able to, even if you have it's like life, right? There are moments of suffering, and there are moments of pleasure, and there are moments, and you try and even if your narrative is sort of political in nature, or you're trying to say something about the political, about politics or the way society is heading, you can, I think, parts that really stay with the reader, parts that really work for the reader, are parts that have that this sort of joyous celebration of some small aspect of life. So you can have both those elements in a narrative, in a story, and a story can work successfully with both those things going to hand in hand.
Yes, it's the fetishization that I was against. It's when people write books about the fact that their son has spina bifida and their husband is in jail and their mother has got dementia and there is no hope. I don't want to read this book. My life is very short. I will soon be dead forever, and I don't want to read that book.
It's so surprising that you say this about Australian writers, because I think there's a lot of Indian writers who, head down that path too.
Really? Yes.
Have you watched Hindi films? Because there'll be a lot of suffering. Someone is poor, someone is doing something, they lose their job, and then the father dies, but in the very next scene, they're dancing around a tree, singing a song, and the rain is falling. Yes. So we are able to mix together suffering and joy all the time, man.
Yes, you are more sophisticated.
So a last question before we throw it open to the audience to ask questions. Is it the role of the novelist to leave spaces in his or her book for readers to insert themselves, help cope with you don't know what. You don't know what the situation of a reader's life is. You don't know in which generation will read it. Is this something, Amitav, you keep in mind?
Boss, I do think that the difference between an op-ed and a novel, or the difference between an op-ed and a piece of accurate, evocative reportage, is that the first one says what the person thinks and asks you to agree with what the person says. Everything else is art. So when I'm feeling lazy as a teacher, I scratch out those pages where the students are doing the first by just saying op-ed, you won't pass my class if you do this. No way. So, मैं तो वही सोचता हूँ हमेशा.
Just to the idea of helping the reader cope, I mean, I think as a writer, you set out to you're trying to cope yourself with what all you see. I would never try and help the reader cope with anything. There's way too much out there. All the baggage they carry, all the baggage I carry, that's what's going into my novel. So it's mostly it's like an exercise in coping myself.
But would you leave spaces in the novel consciously? I mean, I don't know how you work through your drafts for say, let the reader decide this. Let me not tell her.
Of course, that's an important part of fiction, I think, is not making things very explicit. Also, I've never done any long form in non-fiction. I've done reporting, of course, but not anything of that length. But I think in fiction, it is important to leave these little gaps in your narrative. Not gaps in the narrative, but in you have to let the reader sort of come to surmise things for themselves in a lot of places. But that, I think, is more of a that's a part of the skill of being a writer and the pleasure you get as a reader. That's what I enjoyed from books that I read, and is sort of coming to certain conclusions on my own, not being hammered, every point not being hammered home or, ad nauseum.
And last question to you, Robert. Robert's last book is called The Pleasures of Leisure, where he asks the question, why is there so little empty time in our lives? And to answer this question, you go back to the great writers, including great quotes from Pooh Bear.
I didn't hear that last bit.
You have lovely quotes from Pooh Bear to answer your question, about doing nothing.
Pooh Bear or Flaubert?
Pooh Bear. Winnie the Pooh.
Yes, doing nothing on any particular afternoon is quite difficult. But we must practice. And yesterday I practiced and I went to Marina Beach and did it. And felt a much better man for it, I must say. But it is difficult in our society, in Western society, I think probably easier for Indians, to do nothing without having a guilty conscience. The first half of my book is called Loafing. Leisure I divide into three kinds: loafing, nesting, and then play. And as I grow older, the interesting thing is, and many people in the audience will know precisely what I mean, I feel less urgent about time, not more urgent. If I miss the tram or miss the bus, I don't care. I sit and stare into space. When I was young, I thought I should do something about it. And I don't read my mobile phone either, as a matter of fact. You didn't ever come back to women.
Yeah, as the only woman on the stage. Is there, this is completely unrelated to the topic, but you know, Ian McEwan said, as long as they're women, their fiction will be read. Are any of you conscious that a larger number of your readers are women than men?
I write to a woman. She's got a name. I mean, I'm gay, but I write for women. The sorts of things that I think women will want to think about and argue with me about. Without women, I'm serious. We are dead. Women read, women talk, women write letters. Women have not made up their minds. So many men have made up their minds.
Shall we take questions?
Thank you so much for such an enlightening, engaging panel. I'm a New York-based author, writer, and journalist with roots in India. And my question is, you know, in today's global landscape, this is, you know, for Amitav, but anyone can feel free to answer, any of you. In the US market, you know, the first part of this question is, how do you strike a balance between commercial fiction and literary fiction? And in the US market especially, you know, there's a lot more money to be made in movies and, you know, movies by way of book adaptations and so on. And, you know, the likes of Gillian Flynn, which, you know, her writings are completely different from George Saunders, for example, Lincoln in the Bardo. So how does a writer strike a balance? This is also for Robert. How does a writer strike a balance between writing from the heart and appealing to the need for the industry to make money, especially in markets like the US? Thank you.
Is it a balance you're conscious of?
You know, the thing I'm more conscious of is how do I write in a way that doesn't seem to cater to a taste for the exotic in the West and doesn't seem to bore the hell out of my readers in India. That bothers me more. I am alert to what the audience member was asking in the sense that, you know, it was great for my novel to be sold in America. I wanted it to be sold. Now, how did I think it would strike a balance? Well, in the way that I have to write things that would be intelligible and appealing. And how does one do that? I think what people like Chekhov and many others said, when you are specific, you are universal. If you attend to what is happening in one village and are true to that experience, it will also appeal to a reader in a city in Japan, because you are so accurately portraying what is one condition. So I think that is the way to strike a balance, frankly.
The second part of the question.
Yes, I do not try to strike a balance. I write and expect people to eavesdrop. And if they don't like what they're listening, they can go away. They can change the channel. That's all I can do. In one of my books, the first sentence was, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau once wrote, blah, blah, blah. The editor said, well, you should say, as the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote. I said, well, first of all, he wasn't French, he was Swiss. But secondly, if you don't know who Jean-Jacques Rousseau was, don't bother reading my book.
Thank you so much. My first query is to Robert. In your engagement with leisure, and especially when you mentioned, let us have an empty time in the afternoon, but you went to the beach. That was also a way of being with time, which was not totally empty. So therefore, if we cultivate further, how do we be with time in between emptiness and a certain kind of quest for fullness? And given the thrust of the panel about the role of the novelist, therefore, how do we cultivate this novel as an art form to help us? And my second quick query to the panelists is that novel as a form, how does it grapple with the idea of the prose and the poetic? Because the modern novel came up as a response to the limitations of the poetic to grapple with the complexity of the human life. But now there is a challenge which is already demonstrated to go beyond the genre of the prose and the poetic and to create a kind of a new genre, to grapple with the complexity as well as the beauty of the human condition.
Goodness me, is that a typical Indian question?
You take the first part, I think Prayag.
I will be very brief.
The second.
You cannot do nothing. The only way of doing nothing is to be completely dead. But it's why I do not practice mindfulness, because it is too close to being dead. What you can do is try to be master of your own time. So in going to Marina Beach, I was showing some mastery over time. That's all I can do. And that's not the only thing you do. With time you also play. You read books, you play chess, you take the dog for a walk, you go to the opera, you sing, you clean the house, you do many things. You do not only do nothing. Mastery of your own time is the important thing. Seneca wrote about it. If you want to know about mastering time, read Seneca. The Romans knew everything already 2,000 years ago. I don't know why we bother writing anything at all. As far as the poetics of the text are concerned, you either can do it or you can't, quite honestly. I don't think there's any point in doing a creative writing course to learn how to do it. Read books, read Chekhov, read Tolstoy, read Turgenev, read people who can do it. I read Neem Mukherjee, for example. Read people who know how to do it, and then you will do it. Not their ideas, but the form.
Prayag, do you want to add to that? Because I think what Prayag, he'll be a better person to say, didn't let himself be limited by this burden of authenticity. He assumed a woman's voice, and maybe that's playing with the genre too.
I was actually going to make a little comment about the first part of the question also, which was that I think it's a very interesting question because it demonstrates the difference between the attitude to leisure in India and in Australia. In Australia, I think for you it was a day of going to the beach was quite a leisurely activity, but for many Indians, going to the beach is quite a busy afternoon. So it's like, it all depends. It's all matter of perspective. Where does the leisure start? I think for the second part of the question, the second question was trying to look at what, I think you're not trying to expand I couldn't possibly expand the potential of a novel, or any kind of writing. What I can try and do is try and be as true to the story I have in my head and try and tell that in the most effective way possible, in the way that can hit home with the reader, in a way that can make the reader feel something. That's all you're really trying to do with the story is, try and make the reader feel something that you have felt, and try and create something try and add something of even marginal or mild beauty to the world that can, that really shows something. More than that, more than looking at genre, looking at, what kind of fiction. I wasn't really bothered. A lot of people have said my novel is a dystopian novel, but it's not a kind of literature I read very much of, and it's not, so I wasn't really interested in, what dystopian novels do and what they set out to do and what are the elements of a dystopian novel or what are the elements that I should hit. I was more interested in writing a kind of novel in a world that I was trying to represent and writing the kind of novel I wanted to read and I wanted to write.
Yeah.
I think last question.
Question to Mr. Akbar. You spoke about leaving space to the readers. Just fill this one space alone. Pronounce the title of your debut novel. That will do.
I call her Laila, though my publisher at my book launch said Leela, but it's definitely Laila, that's the way I say it.
So if it is made into a movie, it will be Laila.
I guess so, yeah.
Thank you.
So on that note, go get the novel. Yeah. And thank you so much for this very illuminating discussion.